What pushes a man to the edge? What darkness lurks behind the closed doors of a seemingly perfect marriage? Today, we delve into a story so chilling, it will make you question everything you thought you knew about the people you love. But before we pull back the curtain on this tale of deception and murder, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, so you never miss another journey into the shadows. Now, let's begin. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and lavender-scented laundry detergent filled the air of 127 Maple Drive. It was a symphony of domesticity, a carefully orchestrated performance conducted by a master of the art, Eleanor Vance. From the outside, the Vances were the envy of the quiet suburban neighborhood. A charming two-story house with a white picket fence, a meticulously manicured lawn where their golden retriever, Buddy, often chased squirrels, and a love story that seemed to have been plucked from the pages of a romance novel. Arthur Vance, a man whose quiet demeanor was often mistaken for shyness, was a successful architect. His designs were clean, modern, and sought after. He possessed a methodical mind, one that found comfort in clean lines and predictable outcomes. Eleanor, with her radiant smile and infectious laughter, was the perfect counterpoint to his stoicism. She was a freelance writer, her words weaving tales of romance and adventure, a stark contrast to the rigid blueprints that consumed her husband's days. Their life, to any observer, was a portrait of idyllic bliss. Mornings began with shared smiles over coffee. Afternoons were punctuated by Eleanor's cheerful chatter as she recounted her day, and evenings were spent in comfortable silence, the television a low hum in the background. But beneath the placid surface of their carefully constructed reality, hairline cracks were beginning to form, invisible to the naked eye but threatening to shatter the entire facade. The first tremor, so subtle it was almost imperceptible, came in the form of a misplaced book. Eleanor was a creature of habit. Her worn copy of Pride and Prejudice had a permanent home on her bedside table. One Tuesday morning, she found it nestled amongst Arthur's architectural journals on his side of the bed. When she questioned him, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face before he offered a simple, "I must have moved it in my sleep, my love." Eleanor, ever trusting, accepted the explanation, the seed of unease too small to take root. Then came the late nights at the office, a sudden influx of projects that demanded Arthur's undivided attention. He would return home long after Eleanor was asleep, the faint scent of a perfume that wasn't hers clinging to his clothes. He'd blame it on a colleague, a brief hug in celebration of a secured contract. Eleanor, desperate to believe in the life they had built, would nod and force a smile, the questions in her mind a dissonant chorus she refused to acknowledge. The silences between them grew longer, the comfortable quiet of the past now heavy with unspoken words. Arthur, once an attentive listener to Eleanor's stories, now seemed to retreat into a world of his own, his eyes distant, his responses monosyllabic. He'd spend hours in his study, the door locked, the low murmur of his voice on the phone a constant, yet indecipherable presence. Eleanor's laughter, once the vibrant soundtrack of their home, became a strained melody, a desperate attempt to recapture a harmony that was fading. One rain-slicked Thursday evening, the cracks widened into a chasm. Eleanor had prepared Arthur's favorite meal, a rich beef bourguignon that had simmered for hours, its aroma a warm embrace. She had set the table with their best china, lit candles, and put on a playlist of their favorite songs from their courtship. It was an anniversary of sorts, the day they had first met. But when Arthur finally walked through the door, his face was a mask of indifference. He barely glanced at the carefully prepared scene, his eyes fixed on his phone. "I have to go back to the office," he announced, his voice flat, devoid of the apology she expected. "Something's come up." Eleanor's carefully constructed composure crumbled. "But Arthur, it's our—" He cut her off, a sharpness in his tone she had never heard before. "I don't have time for this, Eleanor." He was already shrugging back into his coat, the rain a mournful symphony against the window pane. That night, for the first time in their 10 years of marriage, Eleanor slept in the guest room. The bed felt cold and vast without him, the silence of the house a suffocating blanket. The next morning, she found a hastily scribbled note on the kitchen counter. "Sorry about last night. We'll make it up to you." But the words were hollow, a perfunctory gesture that did little to soothe the ache in her heart. The final, shattering blow came a week later. Eleanor, in a desperate attempt to bridge the growing chasm between them, decided to surprise Arthur at his office with lunch. She packed his favorite sandwiches, a thermos of hot coffee, and a small slice of the lemon drizzle cake he adored. As she walked down the polished corridor of his firm, a strange sense of foreboding washed over her. His office door was slightly ajar, and as she drew closer, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. Laughter. Not just any laughter, but the low, seductive chuckle of a woman, intertwined with the deeper timbre of Arthur's voice, a voice she hadn't heard filled with such warmth in months. She pushed the door open, her hand trembling. The scene that greeted her was a tableau of betrayal. Arthur was leaning against his desk, a woman with fiery red hair and a dress the color of sin pressed against him. His hands were tangled in her hair, his lips on hers. They sprang apart at her entrance, guilt and shock warring for dominance on their faces. The woman, whose name she would later learn was Isabella, had the audacity to offer a smug, unapologetic smile. The world tilted on its axis. The carefully constructed reality Eleanor had clung to with such desperation shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The sandwiches and coffee, symbols of her love and devotion, crashed to the floor, a messy testament to her broken heart. She fled, the sound of Arthur calling her name a distant, meaningless echo. Back in the sanctuary of her home, a storm of emotions raged within her. Grief, anger, and a profound sense of betrayal warred for dominance. The house, once a symbol of their shared love, now felt like a prison, its walls echoing with the ghosts of a life that was a lie. When Arthur finally returned, his face was a mixture of remorse and a chillingly unfamiliar resolve. He didn't plead for forgiveness, didn't offer excuses. Instead, he delivered a speech that was both brutally honest and terrifyingly cold. He told her that their marriage had been a mistake, a comfortable arrangement that had stifled him. He spoke of a love that was passionate and all-consuming, a love he had found with Isabella. He told Eleanor that he wanted a divorce. The words hung in the air, each one a separate, stinging blow. Eleanor, her voice barely a whisper, refused. She had poured her entire being into this marriage, had sacrificed her own ambitions to support his. She would not let him discard her so easily. Her refusal, born of a desperate hope that she could somehow salvage the wreckage of their life, was her fatal mistake. A darkness she had never seen before descended upon Arthur's face. The quiet, methodical man she had married was gone, replaced by a stranger with cold, calculating eyes. He saw her not as the woman he had once loved, but as an obstacle, a problem that needed to be eliminated. The architect, the man who built things, now had a new project: deconstruction. The days that followed were a living nightmare. Arthur's coldness was a constant, oppressive presence. He moved into the guest room, the same room Eleanor had sought refuge in just a week before. The house became a battlefield of silent warfare, every shared space a fresh reminder of their fractured reality. Eleanor, her heart a raw, open wound, clung to the hope that he would come to his senses, that the man she loved was still in there somewhere, buried beneath the layers of deceit. She was wrong. The end came on a Tuesday, a day that had once been marked by the simple, comforting routine of a misplaced book. Arthur had been in his study all day, the door locked, the low murmur of his voice on the phone a constant, ominous presence. When he finally emerged, his face was a blank slate, his eyes devoid of any emotion. He found Eleanor in the garden, tending to her roses, their vibrant petals a stark contrast to the grayness that had enveloped her life. She looked up at his approach, a flicker of hope in her eyes. It was that flicker, that last vestige of the love she still held for him, that sealed her fate. He couldn't bear to see it, a constant reminder of the man he had once been, the man he was now determined to erase. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and, with a swift, brutal efficiency that was both shocking and terrifyingly methodical, he ended her life. The scent of roses and freshly turned earth filled the air, a grotesque parody of the domestic bliss they had once shared. As Eleanor's vibrant life ebbed away, the last thing she saw was the face of the man she had loved, a face now twisted into a mask of monstrous resolve. The architect had completed his project. The obstacle had been removed. Now he could begin to build his new life, a life built on a foundation of lies and a secret buried beneath the roses. The silence that descended upon 127 Maple Drive in the aftermath of Eleanor's final breath was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, a stark contrast to the vibrant life that had once filled its rooms. For a long moment, Arthur Vance stood over the still form of his wife, the setting sun casting long, ominous shadows across the manicured lawn. The scent of her blood, commingling with the sweet fragrance of the roses she had so lovingly tended, was a cloying, visceral assault on his senses. But there was no panic, no remorse in the architect's methodical mind. There was only the cold, hard reality of the task that lay ahead. He was a man who dealt in blueprints, in the precise and calculated execution of a plan. And in the chilling clarity of that moment, a new blueprint began to form in his mind, a detailed and meticulous plan for the deconstruction of one life and the construction of another. The first and most crucial step was the removal of the primary obstacle, Eleanor's body. He wrapped her in a thick tarpaulin he retrieved from the garden shed, the coarse material a stark and unceremonious shroud for the woman who had once been the center of his world. He then carried her, her slight frame surprisingly heavy in the dead weight of her finality, to the basement. The basement, with its cool, damp air and the earthy smell of the exposed foundation, had always been a place of storage, a repository for the forgotten relics of their life together. Now it was to become her tomb. With a chillingly calm resolve, Arthur began to dig. He chose a spot beneath the staircase, a dark and rarely traversed corner of the cellar. The work was arduous, the packed earth and clay resisting his efforts. But he was a man of remarkable physical strength, a strength he had always channeled into the more benign pursuits of home renovation and landscaping. Now, that strength was being used for a far more sinister purpose. Hours bled into one another, the only sound the rhythmic scrape of the shovel against the earth, a macabre percussion in the otherwise silent house. Sweat poured down his face, mingling with the grime and the dust, but he didn't stop. He was driven by a single-minded determination, a desperate need to erase all traces of his monstrous act. As the hole grew deeper, he thought of Eleanor. Not of the vibrant, laughing woman he had married, but of the obstacle she had become, the final, frustrating impediment to the life he now so desperately craved with Isabella. By the time the first rays of dawn pierced the gloom of the basement, the hole was deep enough. He gently, almost reverently, lowered her body into the cold, dark earth. For a fleeting moment, as he looked down at her shrouded form, a flicker of something akin to grief pierced the icy shell of his composure. But he quickly, ruthlessly, extinguished it. There was no room for sentiment in this new life he was building. He filled the hole with the same methodical precision with which he had dug it, tamping down the earth until it was level with the rest of the basement floor. He then covered the area with a stack of old boxes, a seemingly random assortment of Christmas decorations and forgotten childhood toys, a carefully constructed camouflage for the horror that lay beneath. The next phase of his plan was the creation of a narrative, a story that would explain Eleanor's sudden and inexplicable disappearance. He started by sending a text message from her phone to her sister, a rambling, emotional message about needing to get away, about the pressures of her life becoming too much to bear. He then packed a small suitcase with some of her clothes, a few of her favorite books, and her toiletries, a prop in the elaborate play he was staging. He drove her car to a bus station in a neighboring town, leaving it in the long-term parking lot, the suitcase on the passenger seat. He then returned home and, with a chillingly convincing performance of a distraught and worried husband, he called the police. He told them that Eleanor had left, that she had been struggling with depression, that she had packed a bag and taken her car. He played the part of the concerned spouse to perfection, his voice laced with a carefully calibrated mixture of anxiety and fear. The police, accustomed to dealing with cases of adults who simply chose to walk away from their lives, took his report, offered their sympathies, and promised to keep an eye out for her. With the official narrative established, Arthur moved on to the next, and in some ways the most audacious part of his plan, the introduction of Isabella into his life and into the home he had once shared with Eleanor. He waited a respectable, yet not overly suspicious, amount of time a week before he called her. He told her that Eleanor had left him, that their marriage was over, that he was finally free. Isabella, who had been waiting in the wings, a willing and eager accomplice in the destruction of a marriage, was overjoyed. Her arrival at 127 Maple Drive was a jarring and surreal experience. The house, still imbued with the lingering essence of Eleanor, her scent on the pillows, her books on the nightstand, her half-finished novel on her desk, now had a new mistress. Isabella, with her vibrant, almost aggressive energy, was a stark contrast to Eleanor's gentle presence. She moved through the house with a proprietary air, her laughter, so different from Eleanor's, echoing in the once quiet rooms. She began to systematically erase all traces of her predecessor. She packed away Eleanor's clothes, donating them to a local charity. She replaced the soft, muted colors of Eleanor's decor with bold, dramatic hues. She even insisted on getting a new mattress for the master bedroom, claiming that she couldn't sleep in the bed that he had shared with another woman. Arthur, for his part, acquiesced to all of her demands. He was a man adrift, and Isabella, with her fierce and unwavering certainty, was his anchor. But living in the house with the knowledge of what lay buried beneath its foundations was a constant, gnawing source of anxiety for Arthur. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, sent a jolt of fear through him. He found himself avoiding the basement, the once innocuous space now a place of unspeakable horror. He would have nightmares, vivid and terrifying dreams in which the earth in the basement would begin to shift, and a pale, ghostly hand would reach up from the darkness. Isabella, blissfully unaware of the gruesome secret that lay just a few feet beneath her, was in a state of euphoric bliss. She had finally gotten what she wanted. The man she loved, the beautiful house, the life she had always dreamed of. She reveled in her role as the new lady of the house, hosting lavish dinner parties for their friends. Her laughter and a vibrant energy a stark and almost sacrilegious contrast to the quiet, gentle presence of Eleanor. But even in her happiness, there were moments of unease. She would sometimes catch Arthur staring at a particular spot in the garden, a look of such profound sadness on his face that it would send a chill down her spine. When she would question him, he would simply shake his head and say that he was thinking of Eleanor, that he was worried about her. But there was something in his eyes, a darkness that she couldn't quite decipher, that made her wonder if there was more to the story of his wife's disappearance than he was letting on. The neighbors, too, were a source of concern. They had been fond of Eleanor, her warmth and kindness a welcome presence in their quiet suburban community. They were polite to Isabella, but there was a coolness in their demeanor, a subtle but unmistakable judgment in their eyes. They whispered amongst themselves, their hushed conversations a constant reminder of the woman who was missing, the woman who had been so callously replaced. As the weeks turned into months, a strange and unsettling routine began to establish itself at 127 Maple Drive. Arthur and Isabella played the part of the happy couple, their lives a carefully constructed performance for the outside world. But beneath the surface, a dark and insidious secret festered, a secret that was as much a part of the house as its very foundations. The architect had built his new life, but it was a life built on a foundation of lies, a life lived in the constant, terrifying shadow of the woman who was buried beneath their home. The first year of Arthur and Isabella's life together at 127 Maple Drive was a masterclass in deception. To the outside world, they were a couple deeply in love, a tragic but ultimately heartwarming story of two people who had found happiness in the wake of a painful separation. Arthur played the part of the grieving but resilient husband, his public pronouncements of concern for Eleanor's well-being a carefully crafted performance of a man holding out hope for his missing wife's safe return. Isabella, for her part, was the supportive and understanding new partner, her presence a symbol of a fresh start, a new chapter in a life that had been so cruelly disrupted. They hosted dinner parties, their laughter echoing in the rooms that had once been filled with the gentle hum of Eleanor's quiet contentment. They worked in the garden, planting new flowers over the very spot where Eleanor's life had been so brutally extinguished. They even adopted a new dog, a boisterous Labrador puppy, a deliberate and calculated replacement for Buddy, the golden retriever who had been so devoted to Eleanor and who had mysteriously disappeared shortly after she had. Arthur had told the neighbors that Buddy had run away, heartbroken over his mistress's absence. In reality, he had taken the dog to a shelter miles away, unable to bear the constant, mournful searching in the animal's eyes. But beneath the carefully constructed facade of their perfect life, the cracks were beginning to show. The weight of their secret was a heavy, corrosive presence, eating away at the foundations of their relationship. Arthur, once a man of calm and collected demeanor, became increasingly prone to fits of paranoia and anxiety. He would spend hours in his study, the door locked, poring over news articles about missing persons, his mind a maelstrom of worst-case scenarios. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar car that drove down their quiet suburban street, sent a jolt of terror through him. Isabella, too, was beginning to feel the strain. The initial euphoria of having won her prize had faded, replaced by a growing sense of unease. She found herself living with a ghost, the specter of Eleanor a constant, unseen presence in their home. She would find old photographs of Eleanor tucked away in drawers, a half-finished scarf in a knitting basket, a faint whiff of her perfume in the back of a closet. These small, seemingly insignificant reminders of the woman she had replaced were a constant source of irritation and insecurity. The house itself seemed to conspire against them. Strange things began to happen, things that Isabella, a woman of a rational and pragmatic nature, couldn't explain. Doors would creak open on their own, objects would be inexplicably moved, and a faint, mournful sighing sound could sometimes be heard in the dead of night. Arthur would dismiss her concerns as the product of an overactive imagination, but she could see the fear in his eyes, a fear that mirrored her own. The first tangible threat to their carefully constructed world came in the form of a letter. It was addressed to Eleanor, and it had been forwarded from her sister's house. It was from an old college friend, a woman who had recently moved back to the area and was eager to reconnect. Isabella, her curiosity piqued, opened the letter. It was filled with fond reminiscences of their shared past, and it ended with an invitation to meet for lunch. Isabella showed the letter to Arthur, a triumphant glint in her eye. "See," she said, "people are starting to forget about her. They're moving on." But Arthur didn't share her sense of relief. The letter was a reminder that Eleanor had a life, a history, a network of people who cared about her, people who would not so easily forget her. A few weeks later, a more serious threat emerged. A private investigator, hired by Eleanor's increasingly concerned sister, began making inquiries in the neighborhood. He was a persistent, methodical man, a man who, like Arthur, had a keen eye for detail and an unwavering commitment to uncovering the truth. He spoke to the neighbors, who, with their veiled and judgmental comments, painted a picture of a devoted wife who had been callously cast aside. He spoke to Eleanor's friends, who vehemently refuted Arthur's claims that she had been depressed or unstable. The investigator's presence was a constant, unnerving source of anxiety for Arthur. He felt as though his every move was being watched, his every word scrutinized. He and Isabella were forced to be even more careful, their every interaction a carefully rehearsed performance. The strain was beginning to take its toll on their relationship. The passion that had once defined them had been replaced by a shared sense of desperation and fear. They argued constantly, their whispered, frantic conversations a stark contrast to the idyllic picture of domestic bliss they presented to the world. The breaking point came on a sweltering summer afternoon. A plumbing issue had forced them to call in a professional. As the plumber worked in the basement, his clanging and banging a dissonant symphony in the otherwise silent house. A sudden, torrential downpour began. The rain, a welcome relief from the oppressive heat, quickly turned into a deluge. The old house, with its aging infrastructure, was no match for the force of the storm. The basement, the one place in the house that Arthur had so desperately tried to avoid, began to flood. As the water level rose, it began to disturb the carefully packed earth in the corner beneath the staircase. The boxes that had been so strategically placed to conceal the horror that lay beneath were now floating in the murky, rising water. And then, to Arthur's absolute horror, a small, pale object, dislodged from its earthen grave, bobbed to the surface. It was a human bone. The plumber, his work finished, came upstairs to give them the bill. He was a jovial, talkative man, and he commented on the severity of the flooding. "You're lucky I was here," he said. "That whole basement could have been a swimming pool." As he spoke, his eyes were drawn to a small, white object that was lying on the floor near the basement door, an object that had been carried up from the flooded depths on a wave of muddy water. "What's this?" he asked, bending down to pick it up. The world seemed to slow down, every sound amplified, every detail magnified. Arthur's heart hammered in his chest, a frantic, desperate drumbeat of pure, unadulterated terror. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that his carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. The plumber, his brow furrowed in a mixture of curiosity and confusion, held up the object. It was a human finger bone, a small, stark, and irrefutable testament to the monstrous crime that had been committed in the quiet, unassuming house on Maple Drive. The architect's carefully constructed facade, the one he had so meticulously built and so desperately tried to maintain, had finally irrevocably crumbled. The truth, in all its gruesome and horrifying detail, had been unearthed. The story of the man who had murdered his wife, dismembered her, and buried her beneath their home, the man who had then had the audacity to live with his lover in the very same house, was about to be told. And this time, there would be no escaping the consequences. The foundation of lies upon which he had built his new life had been washed away, and all that was left was the cold, hard, and unforgiving reality of his own monstrous creation. The perfect lie had unraveled, and the architect of deception was about to be buried under the weight of his own design. The silence in the kitchen of 127 Maple Drive was a tangible thing, a vacuum that sucked all the air from the room. It was broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the window panes and the low hum of the refrigerator. The plumber, a man named Dave, stood frozen, his hand outstretched, holding the small, white object that had brought their world to a screeching halt. The finger bone, cleaned by the muddy water, gleamed under the harsh kitchen light, an irrefutable accusation. Arthur's mind, the architect's mind that had so meticulously planned every detail of his perfect lie, was a maelstrom of white noise. There were no more blueprints, no more contingency plans. He was staring at the single, unforeseen variable that had just demolished his entire structure. His gaze flickered from the bone in Dave's hand to Isabella's face. Her expression was a canvas of confusion, a slight, nervous laugh playing on her lips as she failed to grasp the magnitude of the moment. "What is that? Some old chicken bone the dog buried?" she asked, her voice unnaturally high. But Dave, a man who had spent weekends hunting and had a passing familiarity with anatomy, slowly shook his head. His jovial demeanor had vanished, replaced by a pale, grim mask. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, serious rumble, "this ain't no chicken bone." He looked directly at Arthur, and in his eyes, Arthur saw not just suspicion, but dawning certainty. In that instant, Arthur's carefully maintained composure shattered. Primal fear, cold and absolute, took over. He lunged, not at Dave, but for the phone on the wall. His only thought was to stop the call he knew was coming. But he was too late. Dave, reacting with surprising speed, took a step back, his other hand already reaching for his own cell phone in his pocket. "I'm calling 911, he stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. The next few hours were a blur of flashing blue and red lights painting surreal patterns on the walls of their home. The quiet suburban street was suddenly alive with the grim efficiency of law enforcement. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, peeked through their curtains, their whispers finally finding a horrifying validation. The house on Maple Drive, once a symbol of idyllic success, was now a crime scene, cordoned off with stark yellow tape that seemed to scream its secrets to the world. Arthur and Isabella were separated immediately. Isabella, still wrapped in a state of bewildered denial, was guided to a police car, her protests a mixture of outrage and confusion. Arthur was sat down at his own dining room table, the polished wood now reflecting the cold, impassive faces of two detectives. He tried to cling to his narrative, the story of the depressed wife who had run away. But his words were hollow, his performance unconvincing even to his own ears. The discovery in the basement had ripped the mask away, and all that was left was the raw, desperate face of a trapped man. The true horror began to unfold in the basement. As a forensic team began the slow, painstaking process of pumping out the water and excavating the earth beneath the stairs, the full scope of Arthur's monstrous act was unearthed. Under the cold, clinical lights of the investigators, the makeshift grave gave up its dead. The dismembered remains of Eleanor Vance, wrapped in the same tarpaulin he had used to carry her, were brought back into the light. The architect's most terrible secret was now physical evidence, tagged and catalogued for the world to see. In a sterile interrogation room, the walls closing in on her, Isabella's world finally and completely imploded. Presented with the undeniable truth of what had been found in the basement of her home, her lover's home, her denial crumbled into horrified hysterics. The ghosts she had felt, the strange noises, the oppressive atmosphere of the house site all clicked into place with sickening clarity. She hadn't been living with the memory of a woman. She had been living on top of her corpse. The man she had adored, the man for whom she had compromised her morals, was not a grieving husband but a monster. Faced with the possibility of being charged as an accomplice, her survival instinct kicked in. Through her sobs, she told them everything she knew. About the affair, about Eleanor's refusal to grant a divorce, about Arthur's chilling resolve to have the life he wanted, no matter the cost. Arthur's confession, when it finally came, was delivered with the same cold, methodical detachment with which he had planned the murder. Stripped of his lies, he seemed to find a strange sort of freedom in the truth. He detailed the crime without a flicker of remorse, describing the act of killing and dismembering his wife with the clinical precision of an architect explaining a blueprint. He spoke of her as an obstacle, a complication, that needed to be removed so he could proceed with the next phase of his life. The detectives listened in stunned silence, chilled to the bone by the profound emptiness behind his eyes. The trial was a media sensation. Dubbed the architect of deception by the press, Arthur Vance became a symbol of the darkness that can lurk beneath a veneer of suburban respectability. The courtroom was packed every day with a morbidly curious public, all there to watch the final deconstruction of a man who had built his life on a foundation of lies. The testimony of Eleanor's sister, her voice thick with grief, painted a portrait of a vibrant, loving woman stolen from her family. The plumber, Dave, recounted the moment of discovery, his simple, honest words sealing Arthur's fate. Isabella, granted immunity in exchange for her testimony, took the stand as the star witness for the prosecution. She was a broken woman, a pariah in the eyes of the public and in her own mind. She recounted the story of their affair, her voice barely a whisper, the shame and horror evident in every word. She was as much a victim of Arthur's deception as anyone, a pawn in his monstrous game, and she would carry the weight of her unwitting complicity for the rest of her life. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Arthur Vance was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away in handcuffs, he cast one final, empty look at the life he had destroyed. There was no rage, no sorrow, only the cold, blank acceptance of a project that had failed. The house at 127 Maple Drive was eventually sold, but its history was now an indelible stain on the quiet neighborhood. It became a local legend, a place of dark tourism, a constant, grim reminder of the secrets that had been buried within its walls. The new owners tore out the rose garden, unable to bear the thought of what had nourished its roots. In the end, the truth had done what water in a basement always does. It found the cracks, seeped through the foundations, and rose to the surface, unstoppable and absolute. Eleanor Vance, the woman who had been silenced and buried, was finally given a voice. Her name was cleared, her memory honored, and her story served as a chilling testament to the fact that no matter how deep you bury a secret, no matter how perfectly you design a lie, the truth will always, eventually, find its way out. The House of Reckoning had claimed its architect.